we're talking about record-breaking cold temperatures.
The strongest evidence yet, human-caused climate change.
Hello and welcome to this special edition of Global Climate Talk on CGTN. I'm Guan in Beijing. The Earth Day 2022 theme is Invest in Our Planet. What can be done to promote investment to build a green economy and secure a sustainable future? How to get business leaders on board to take bold actions? What can be done by governments to incentivize necessary industrial and tech innovations? To explore these issues, I'm very delighted today to be joined by three distinguished guests. Laurent Fabius, former French PM and now President of the Constitutional Council, IFF Board Member, and also former chair of COP21, who helped forge the landmark Paris Agreement. Welcome to the show, Mr. Fabius.
Hello.
And Erik Solheim, former Under-Secretary General of the UN and Executive Director of UNEP, and currently Ms. Solheim is President of Green Belt and Road Institute, also a Senior Advisor to World Resources Institute. Mr. Solheim, it's great to have you with us today.
Thank you so much, Ni hao.
Thank you, Ni hao. And Marco Lambertini, Director General of WWF International. With more than 30 years of conservation leadership, Mr. Lambertini has one of the world's largest and most respected conservation organizations. Thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you.
So let's start with the ongoing Ukraine crisis. The war in Ukraine has thrown the global economy into chaos. Experts say dysfunction in supply chains and energy shortage will lead to higher costs for consumers, businesses, governments, and ultimately the environment. So, Mr. Fabius, let me start with you, if I may. In your opinion, what does it mean for the environmental landscape? What can be done to prevent the current geopolitical crisis from weakening our momentum towards a net zero future?
Well, obviously, the conflict in Ukraine is a real catastrophe from a human perspective. But your question deals, and I think you're right, about the possible consequences on environment. And my viewpoint is that you have two possible scenarios, a positive one and a negative one. The negative one is that of a return of coal, gas, oil, and there are unfortunately several signs into that direction because many countries, because of the difficulties which are stemming from the conflicts, are going back to coal, are going back to, I would say, traditional energies with CO2 consequences. On the other hand, you have a possible positive scenario, which would mean ending our collective fossil fuels addiction, reinforcing renewables and energy savings, and strengthening cooperation towards a sustainable future. And it's not clear what would be the final scenario, but it is clear that the second one, the positive one, is the good one.
Indeed, it depends on how you see it. It's kind of like is the glass half empty or half full scenario. Mr. Solheim, what are your views on this? Some countries are doubling down on coal or other traditional energy sources, but it may also speed up the transition towards renewable energy.
The immediate effects of the war are, of course, basically negative. For sure, the enormous humanitarian suffering in Ukraine and the need to defend the sovereignty of Ukraine. But in the long run, I take a positive view that this will spur the transition into renewable energies because Europe will want to be energy independent, I think to do good for climate. And the energy independent sources, what's that? I mean, the sun is shining, the wind is blowing. Those are European resources which can be harvested. And I'm just back from India. because an enormous increase in energy prices is a huge shock for India. It's hitting very poor people in the countryside of India. But how can India be defending itself in front of future shocks? Well, to harvest the Indian sun, the Indian hydropower, the Indian wind, all those domestic resources which are there. And I think you see by Prime Minister Modi and the Indian leadership a very, very strong desire to move fast into renewables.
And a lot of positive changes are taking place. And Mr. Lambertini, do you see distraction due to the crisis from our sustainability goals?
First of all, let me just also say that we are all appalled by the escalating war in Ukraine, and our hearts goes to the people that are suffering. And that peace amongst people is actually the foundation for building a future where we are in peace with nature as well.
Right.
Every war has direct and indirect environmental impacts, and ultimately those are also adding up to the suffering of human population. Think about the pollution of land, rivers, the huge amount of CO2 emissions, toxic gas, the destruction of properties, the need for resources, energy, commodities, raw materials to rebuild. So all this has a huge environmental impact. And there is also direct impact. Ukraine is part of the so-called green heart of Europe. Is a country with more than 20% of forests, very ancient forests as well. And all this is being damaged by the war. And so the other thing that we are seeing, and there's a risk outside Ukraine, is for countries to under pressure because of the disruption of the war, of commodities, economy, supply chains, to deregulate environmental laws to counter these impacts and derailing as a consequence the journey towards sustainability. Like Erik, I also want to think, however, that because we are so aware of the impact of climate change and nature loss and the need to counter both crises, that actually this disruption potentially would drive to a quicker transition towards sustainability rather than not.
And that it certainly deserves our high attention. The Earth Day 2022 theme is investing our planet. However, recent UN analysis of the war in Ukraine kind of suggests that as many as 1.7 billion people in 107 economies are exposed to at least one of three risks: food, energy, and finance. Mr. Fabius, how will the ongoing Ukraine crisis affect our ability to mobilize financial resources to meet sustainability goals? How to meet the financing gap?
The financial gap. First, you are right when you summarize the situation at a worldwide level. And I would like to quote my friend, the UN Secretary General Guterres, recently saying, "We are sleepwalking to climate catastrophe." And here, all of us, my two colleagues and myself, obviously we wish that we could have a better situation, but the reality, unfortunately, is that today and the perspective for the future are a catastrophe, and therefore we have to change things. And the different reports which have been made, particularly by IPCC, and the facts that we are facing show that we are unfortunately not going in the right direction. If you refer to the Paris Agreement that I prepared and shared, the aims, the goals, the objectives are very clear, but we are not going in that direction in a satisfactory way. About finance, obviously finance is key. I would say private and public finance. About private finance, I think there are betterments because the companies understand more and more that if you are not in line with fight against climate change, you will be out of the market. And it's true for every company. Therefore, things are not going quickly enough, but they are going in the right direction. Unfortunately, as far as governments are concerned, we are not doing enough. And obviously that is the main point. And I personally think that all our institutions, I mean public banks, private banks, IMF, and so on and so forth, must insist on the fact that if we want to have a livable future, we have to do more. From this viewpoint, there are commitments which have been made and which must be fulfilled. Remember the famous $100 billion, which have been promised in 2009, and they had to take place in 2020. We are now 2 years after, and it is not yet met. Therefore, we have to insist on this public support, because it's not only a question of mitigation, but also on adaptation. And if you want to adapt the different economies, you have to have public financing. But the private financing, in terms of numbers, is more important. And we have every day to make bankers and financial people understand that they have to stop to finance coal, and they have to develop financing renewable, which fortunately are cheaper and cheaper.
Right. Well, there is a financing gap, and there is also a say-do gap. Mr. Solheim, you know that to some extent we can understand. Countries are now facing multiple challenges, which is very urgent: the pandemic, rising inflation, energy and food supply shortages. Are you worried that financing climate action is no longer among the top priorities?
I am not really so worried with the finances, because we have all the finances we need. We just need to change our thinking into all the win-win opportunities. Let's see the environment degradation and climate change as a fantastic opportunity for creating jobs and making our economies more vital, simply to do good for environment and for the economy at the same time. President Xi has said green is gold. It's an enormous opportunity to create welfare and new and better jobs. And that's also why companies all over the world now tend to be ahead of governments, not hiding behind governments. Microsoft and many American companies are far ahead of the American government. Microsoft has promised that they will be carbon neutral by 2030, and that they will compensate for all emissions in the history of the company. In Europe, the furniture maker, the Swedish furniture maker IKEA, is far ahead of any government when it comes to the circular economy. In Indonesia, April, the biggest paper and pulp company in the world, has a zero deforestation policy and is a world leader when it comes to business doing conservation. And in China, of course, Huawei, Tencent, basically all the big companies of China has made substantial climate promises. So the key is to change our thinking into all the win-win opportunities, good for economy and good for ecology at the same time.
So do you agree that we are sleepwalking into a disaster?
I believe that we have put the train on the right track. We are moving in the right direction. However, we are not moving fast enough. We are not urgent enough. But COVID was the time when the world changed. The Russian revolutionary Lenin once said that there are decades when nothing is happening, and then there are years where decades are happening. And COVID was such a period. Now every major company in the world understand that you need to move into the green economy. Otherwise, as Laurent Fabius said, you will lose your markets. So we will see governments and business moving rapidly in the right direction, but we need to give it a further push because we have very little time.
And Mr. Lambertini, what's your view on this? Where are we now in providing much needed financial resources to combat nature loss?
We are slower, much slower than we should be. But I agree with Erik. I think we are on the right track. I think the awareness of and the evidence of the impact we are having on climate and on nature And I will want to stress these two dimensions which are interconnected, climate and nature. The natural habitats, they are so important to sequester carbon from the atmosphere and in natural systems like forest, ocean, marine habitats, etc. So we are beginning to understand that actually the destruction of nature, the destabilization of climate are having direct consequences, not just on the natural world, but on our own lives, on our economy, on our well-being, on our health, on our future, on the future of our children. And so this is a new awakening. This is a deep cultural change in our civilization, the way we look at nature, not anymore as something that we can take for granted, but something that we need to start to care for. And now, this cultural change, it's happening. It's happening everywhere in the world at all levels, corporate, political, society, consumers. We see that growing day by day, but it is not yet translating in the systemic change that we need to see. And the systemic change that we need to see is about embracing a new development model that is carbon neutral, nature positive, that respects the environment, look at nature as an ally, not as an enemy, but still generates the wealth, and bridge the inequality gap that we are suffering today. And that's possible. It's possible through technology, and that's possible, back to the finance question, through redirection, repurposing of the trillions of dollars that are today invested in energy, in agriculture, in fishing, in forestry, in other extraction of natural resources in the unsustainable way. We can actually redirect those huge amounts of private and public finance towards sustainable practices. And that's the challenge, and that's the imperative.
Right. And let's talk more about the argument between developed and developing economies in terms of finance and needs. There has been a debate between the two sides about their responsibilities and commitment. Mr. Fabius, we know this has been discussed about at the Paris Agreement, and there is agreement on the differentiated responsibilities. What financial challenges are developing countries facing, because the developed countries are not delivering their commitments? In particular, this year's COP27 will be held in Egypt. How to mobilize necessary support for African countries to adapt to climate change and access financing?
Yes, you're right. There is a particular inequality towards developing countries because some of them, I think in particular to African countries, are not emitting CO2. But they are the first victims of climate change. And this inequality cannot be managed without public support. You have alluded to the next COPs. The next one will be in Egypt. And my wish, strong wish, and support is that in Egypt, rich countries will meet their commitments that they have taken a long time ago, and this time these commitments must be met. That's the first point. Second point, and not only because of the situation itself, but because we have to insist on adaptation to the situation. And when you have to adapt, you need more and more public finance. Okay. I would like to make three other points. First, you have alluded to COVID. I mean, you're right. And I'm struck by the fact that all our countries are making enormous efforts to overcome COVID, and they're right to do so. But to a certain extent, we are not making the same effort to fight against climate change. And climate change is, to a certain extent, more negative in the long term than COVID. Therefore, it is an argument to insist on that. Second point, an important point, is what we call carbon pricing. I think my friends and colleagues will agree on that. We must develop carbon pricing because we are in a market economy, and if we want to have this necessary change, we have to give a price to carbon emission because it's completely unwise to have a situation where emitting carbon is less expensive than using renewable. Okay. My third point is that, as Marco said, it needs, and Erik as well, it needs big change. It's a systemic change with a positive perspective, but change is not easy. And obviously, when you mean change, you mean having consequences on regions, on some particular people, and especially on the poorest population and regions. And therefore, we have never to separate the technical aspect, the economic financial aspect, and social justice, because otherwise population will not accept these necessary changes. Therefore, I insist on the fact that social justice is a must, and my guess, I would favor, because COPs are taking place every year, the fact that when the different governments publish what we call NDCs, the national contribution, they have to insist not only on the figures, the financial figures, the economic figures, but also on social elements, because it must be clear for population that there is a possibility of a positive future.
Indeed, and it seems every country is looking at climate equity or climate justice in different ways. Some are focusing on history and some are focusing on the future. We know that developed countries also said, and they don't want the financial aid to developing countries to become a liability. Mr. Solheim, how to bridge the differences and work together?
First, we must be fair. I mean, the Western arrogance, which we saw in Glasgow, where some nations were running around finger pointing to India as a culprit of climate emissions. I mean, let's be honest. North American climate emission per capita up to this point are 25 times Indians. India is still under the sustainability level, which we want to bring the climate down to. So how can anyone blame India? India is not a part of the problem. India is a part of the solution, because India is rapidly moving in a green direction. But let's point to China as even better. Chinese emissions are much lower than European or North American up to this point. But China is now rapidly moving ahead, providing the solutions. And the two biggest developing nations, China and India, can do a lot to invest in other developing nations. China last year produced 80% of all solar panels in the world. China last year produced more wind energy than the rest of the world has done in the last 5 years combined. China last year produced 2/3 of all new hydropower in the world. And indeed, 99% of all electric buses in the world are running on Chinese roads. So China is such a lead nation among every technology we do need. And of course, Belt and Road provides an enormous opportunity for spreading these investments to Pakistan or Indonesia or Kenya or South Africa, to all the other developing nations in different sorts of partnerships. When President Xi last year said that China will stop all overseas coal investment, that may have been the most important decision for the environment that year. And of course, it will drive Belt and Road into a vehicle for the renewable energies, because there will be no coal.
And the developing countries can play a key role towards a net zero future. And Mr. Lambertini, do you think more financial support is needed for developing countries? We've heard of debt for nature swaps at COP26, a mechanism that sees a portion of a developing nation's debt written off in exchange for environmental schemes. What's your view on this, or what are some other innovative ways to address this financing needs?
I think this is a really good question and a really important point, because too often in these debates around climate change, but also around nature loss. Recently, there's been negotiations happening in Geneva under the UN Convention on Biological Diversity for a new biodiversity framework that needs to be approved. In fact, China is the host country later in this year and the president of the COP15 of that convention. There have been discussions exactly about that. How can we finance a transition, as was mentioned before, just, equitable, but also effective, towards sustainable use of natural resources, towards energy production which is clean and not destabilizing climate. And what is the role of developed economies and the role of developing economies? The reality is that for challenges like climate change and nature loss that are existential challenges for everything else, because there's not going to be a safe future for humanity in a degraded planet, we need the world to be together. First of all, we need the world to be together in recognizing the issue and moving in the same direction. The Paris Agreement has forged this powerful vision, global goal of carbon neutrality by 2050. The Convention on Biological Diversity has the opportunity to complement a completed job and develop a global goal for nature as well. We are advocating for a nature positive global goal, carbon neutral and nature positive. These are the two global goals that should be the guiding lights for our sustainable development agenda that involves developed economies, reducing their footprint, in supporting financially just and effective transitions in developing economies. But also developing economies had the opportunity and on one hand, also the imperative to actually embrace a new model. They have the opportunity to leapfrog all the dirty development of the past decades happened in other countries and embrace a clean and green direction, which is also more sustainable, more just, and safer in moving forward. So the financial part is a tricky discussion in every negotiation. But your point about innovative approaches is critical, because it's not just about the more obvious finance that could come from ODA, from developed countries to developing countries. It's actually about creating market-based incentives and mechanisms that can support sustainable practices in the sectors I mentioned before: agriculture, fishing, forest infrastructure. All that needs to become sectors that are carbon neutral and nature positive at the same time.
Mm-hmm. Indeed. And the private sector has an enormous role in providing solutions to climate change. We know they have taken a lot of bold actions, but as Marco mentioned earlier, how to catalyze systemic changes? How to encourage and guide private investment? You know that the private sector are often profit-driven. How to align the goals of the private sector and society? Mr. Fabius, you mentioned carbon pricing. I think that is a very innovative way to align the goals. What are some other ways to do this, in your opinion?
I think it's a very important tool, and I relate that to a proposal which has been made by IMF. And one of your observation about poor countries or developing countries. I think nearly everybody agrees that it's an absolute necessity to have a carbon pricing system. But one could say, well, you have it's a good idea, but you have to pay attention to the fact that the level of developments of different countries are not the same. Okay, that's right. And therefore, IMF is working on a possible system where you would have different areas, different zones, and a possibility of a three-tier system regarding carbon pricing. A system for, I would say, rich countries, a system for poor countries, and a system for middle-sized countries. And step by step, when the development becomes more effective, you can have a convergence of these different prices. Obviously, it's not easy to build, but I think it's a good idea because it takes into consideration the necessity of giving a price to carbon and the fact that the different regions of the world, the different countries, are in a different situation. And I think it's realistic and a very interesting way of working. Because take an instance, in Europe today, the price of carbon is about 80 euros. In other countries, some developing countries, there are more and more carbon prices, but it's more about 10 euros. And if you have a system in which you have a convergence between these different elements, it would make sense. And it's one of the reasons why I'm supporting the proposal of IMF, which is a very serious institution, to try and develop this idea and this system.
And that certainly deserves our attention. Actually, China also started the carbon trading last year, and there is an immense potential for possible cooperation between China and other countries. And Mr. Solheim, another thing to look at the green investment is the green standard. A 2020 report of the UN Environment Program warned that only 368 billion of the 14.6 trillion in announced global recovery spending from the COVID-19 pandemic met green standards. How to improve transparency of green economy and how to unify different standards to guide investment?
I believe, like Laurent, that in these issues, Europe provides the leadership we need because Europe, through the Green New Deal and the European taxonomy, is now making an all-European system which will force transparency on companies and which will make it much easier for those who want to invest in the green and much more difficult. High interest rates are more difficult for those who want to stick to the brown. So I mean, Europe is not perfect in all areas for sure. But in this area, the rest of the world should look to the European carbon pricing and the European taxonomy as an inspiration. China is moving in the same direction, as you say. But if you allow me, let me give a very practical example of how we can move fast into change. In my nation, Norway, last year, 80% of all cars sold were electric. We will very soon be 100% because no one has tried an electric car want to go back to the gasoline cars because they are so much poorer than the electric cars. But how did this happen? Happened because the government did set the right policies. When we discussed in the Norwegian government, we told ourselves that no one wants to be the first person in the community to experiment with a car. It's a big expense for the family. You don't want to try something new. So you need to give an introductory offer to fast forward this transition. So we changed the tax burden. Electric cars became cheaper and the gasoline cars became more expensive. And we gave a number of introductory offers to those who bought an electric car. They could go in the bus lanes. They could pay less on parking spots. They paid less when they crossed Norwegian fjords on a ferry. And with these introductory offers, people started buying electric cars. And then a number of people buy electric cars. The market take care of the rest because everyone else now wants an electric car. But you needed the government to make this introductory offer. And to conclude, here there is a universal theory of change in my view. Change happens when citizens demand change, when government regulates market and set the vision, and when you leave it to the market and to business to innovate and take change to scale. Indeed,
and Mr. Lambertini, we know that WWF is actively involving in the biodiversity conservation in many countries. Or what are some of the best practices in encouraging private investment? We heard of public-private partnership, and tell us more about that.
Look, first of all, like for climate, on nature conservation, we are still too slow and very behind. and all the indicators of the health of the planet are still going in the wrong direction. I think we need to be very clear about that. There is no room for complacency. We need to really shift a lot of our practices in key sectors and quickly. I agree very much with what Erik just said and the example he made on electric cars can be replicated in other sectors. Today, for example, there are much more subsidies as incentives going into the production of food, which is based on the old-fashioned approach of squeezing the soil, using a lot of fertilizers and pesticides, versus organic produced food. Organic food in many countries is still more expensive than traditionally grown food. That has to change, and that can change if incentives and subsidies, both public but also private investment, and incentivized towards a more natural way of producing food, which is, by the way, healthier for people as well. But at the same time, food that is produced in a way that is respecting the environment, deforestation-free commodities, deforestation-free grown food. All this is possible through a combination of regulation, and this is where the message of the Paris Convention on Climate has been so powerful, has created a clear direction, has created a level playing field, has sent a strong signal to markets that transition towards a carbon neutral future has to happen. The world agreed to that. In Kunming, we need to agree on an equal direction for a nature positive goal, as I said earlier, where the message to the market is similar in terms of shifting practices in the way we produce food on land, we fish the ocean, in the way we extract other natural resources. That has to be in balance with the planet. That message needs to be codified by the world, and that regulatory dimension is super important to drive then a transition that will be embraced by the business, the investment sector. And by the way, we are hearing increasingly businesses, investors, there are coalitions now being created around sustainable practices that are demanding that clear direction, the clear level playing field for them to be able to comply, to be all on the same level. We're past the time where we can count on a few progressive companies or a few progressive investors. We need to level the playing field. We need to send a strong signal through regulation that will be welcomed by business and will allow that shift, the systemic change that we were discussing before to actually happen.
Indeed. Well, private sector play a key role to our sustainable future. And let's talk more about international cooperation. We've been relying on international cooperation to provide agreement and solutions to the global climate crisis. But now, since the world's multilateral system is seeing increasing challenges, Mr. Fabius, having forged the landmark Paris Agreement when you were chair of the COP21, you were often asked about the secret of achieving a universal agreement. Is it less likely to build consensus in a world which seems to be marked with more fragmentation?
Why were we able to have a success in Paris? Because we have been able to build a consensus between what I call three planets: the scientific and technological planet, clear, the society planet, and the governmental planet. As a matter of fact, today, unfortunately, the governmental planet, I mean the multilateral system, is in a sort of crisis. And there is, I take the wording of Marco, there is no room for complacency. It's a fact. But we have to make all our efforts, as long as climate is concerned and nature, not to destroy, not to accept this multilateral division, but on the contrary, to bring together all the actors. Because if we want to be successful, and it's true for climate change, and it's true for Kunming COP, we have to bring together states, cities, regions, businesses, banks, civil society, and individuals. And we have, and it's not the effort of only one country, it's the effort of every country in the world, because there is no frontier for pollution. There is no frontier for climate change. You can't have customs for that. And therefore, we have to insist on this multilateral effort. From this viewpoint, and I think that a recent initiative has been taken, which is a good one, by UN. It is about the question of evaluation and data and verification. It's very important to have an unquestionable evaluation. And we have some systems for things concerning states. But we up to now, we didn't have a system for non-state action. And the UN has recently created what they call a high-level expert group on the net zero emissions commitments of non-state entities, which is chaired by one of our colleagues, the former Minister of the Environment from Canada, Catherine McKenna, with different countries, different specialists, and they have to properly assess the commitment in a context of multiplication of net zero pledges and of various criteria and standards. And I think this question of evaluation is very important. Now, as I understand we are coming to the end, I would like to add two other observations. The first one is that recently, nearly all the countries have taken long-term commitments. It's good, it's necessary, because if you don't have a long-term perspective, you cannot act. But as the economist Mr. Keynes was saying, in the long term we are all dead. And therefore we have to be sure that the short-term actions are in line with the long-term perspectives. And because it's a race against time. What people sometimes forget is that if you emit CO2 in the atmosphere, it doesn't come down before years and centuries. And therefore, we have to have a coalition of long-term and short-term action. That's my first point. My second and last point is that we, and Marco said that, and he's quite right, we don't have to separate what is climate action, a COP about climate and so on, and nature-based. Obviously, it's maybe more difficult for nature to have clear figures, because, you know, in Paris, to a certain extent, it was simple. 1.5 degrees, 2 degrees, and this sort of system. With nature, it's a bit more difficult. But you cannot separate one issue from another issue, because we know that there is no planet B. Therefore, if we are mixing short-term and long-term evaluation and nature and climate improvement, at that time we can overcome the difficulties, and it's an absolute necessity for mankind.
Right. Well, we should respect science, and that's a bottom line. And Mr. Solheim, you're always looking at the upside. I'd like you to talk more about China. The country is increasingly incorporating open, green, and clean targets into its BRI projects. What's your view on these changes, and how could it make more contributions to green development?
China has changed a lot. I mean, 10 years back, it was true that China was extremely polluted, and people in all the big Chinese cities say, I don't want to live this way. I want to see the sun. I want change. I want my children to breathe clean air. Now, China has made enormous domestic transitions, and China is a global leader. I mentioned earlier, and the global leader basically every environment technology. But China is also now a global leader of environment practice. China is the biggest tree planter in the world. President Xi just launched a huge scheme for national parks in China, taking better care of the panda, the snow leopard, and many other species. China has launched the ecological redlining system, which is the best system in the world, as far as I'm aware of, for protecting nature in difficult places. And China has cleaned up, say, the rivers in Jiangsu province, and indeed now a fishing ban in the Yangtze, which is of course in the short term a big pain, but in the long term an enormous gain for the ecosystem. So the world has so much to learn from China. But for this to happen, we must avoid the geopolitical tensions, because if China on one side and the West on the other, starting an all-out competition, cannot cooperate, everything will be difficult. And we should all realize no nation in the world wants to make the choice. Every nation, every African, Asian, Latin American, European nation want to be very close friends with China and very close friends with the United States, all at the same time, because we see no need for making that choice. We can cooperate, invest, partner, both with China and with the West, and that is the way forward. And if you allow me, when it comes to the most important crisis in the world now, yeah, there are different views. In Europe, there is an all-out support for Ukraine. We believe we need to defend the sovereignty of Ukraine, and we need to get stopped what we see as the Russian aggression now. Most big developing nations, China, India, Brazil, Mexico, Indonesia, take a more neutral view, and they see this conflict as basically a European conflict. But there should be no difficulty bridging this. We should all call for immediate ceasefire. We should call for stop to the war. We should call for talks. We should call for a neutral Ukraine, and we should call for the defense of the sovereignty of Ukraine. All this we should be able to agree to, and then we can work together, even if there are differences, because differences will always be there. The key is to work, even when there are differences across the global system, for the common good. Because if we want to defend nature, as Marco set out here, or if we want to defeat climate change, we can only do it together.
And when China has made it clear that we should respect sovereignty of a country, and China is actively promoting the peace talk. And Mr. Lambertini, we know there is an extremely difficult time. We have the Ukraine war, and we also have the rising competition between China and the US, the world's two largest economies. In your opinion, how can we further boost global cooperation?
By recognizing what has been just said by Fabius and Erik, that actually global challenges like climate change, like nature loss, and many other social challenges, inequalities, anger, poverty, malnutrition, etc., pandemics, require a joint coordinated effort. And unless we really pull together, as Erik said, there will always be differences, and there will be tensions, there will be some level of competition. This is the nature of our species, the nature actually of the rule of nature in many ways, in other species too. But that should not prevent us to come together, us meaning the world, to come together, whether the common benefit, the common interest is so obvious. There is not going to be any winner if we continue to destabilize climate or continue to lose nature and use unsustainably natural resources. Everybody will lose. And so that should appeal to human intelligence to actually put together where it matters, and perhaps continue to disagree on a number of things. But clearly, science has never been more compelling in telling us that unless we come together, we're not going to resolve these big challenges. And ultimately, these big challenges, like talking about the environment, climate change, and nature loss, are really the foundation for everything else. Because this is about the health of our home, of our lifeline, of nature, our mother. And if we lose that, there is no future for humanity. That is the compelling argument for working together and for overcoming the differences.
Indeed. So in the time remaining, I'd like to have each of you to talk briefly about what individual can do to protect our planet, because the Earth Day is about what everyone does matters to our world. Mr. Fabius, would you like to give some advice on our viewers, what they can do?
Well, I will speak about consumers. There are a lot of things to be done to foster change in corporate actions. we can make the right consumption choices in terms of goods, food choices, eating local and seasonal products. In terms of fashion, avoiding fast fashion, choosing sustainable clothing. About low carbon modes of transportation and housing, and reduced use of plastic. And consumers can also turn to banks and services that make and fulfill strong commitments. Therefore, I think that as individuals, we can act in the right direction. One would say, well, it's small gestures. But when you add these different small gestures and small rivers, it can be a big sea.
Okay. And Mr. Solheim, what's your view on this? Briefly?
I very much agree with Laurent on this. I think what he set out was the program of Mahatma Gandhi, who once said that you need to be the change you want to see in this world. And how can we be the change we want to see? Well, support the green politicians in every nation, buy the green products, and then look into your own life. Can you maybe walk or go by bicycle a little bit more, drive a little bit less, maybe have a little bit more vegetarian diet, avoid single-use plastic, and put solar panels on the roof. If you have a cabin or a house or in the neighborhood, put up the solar panels, and then you spur the change. And if everyone tries to be the change we want to see in this world, the world will change very fast.
Indeed, there's a lot that can be done. And Mr. Lambertini?
Well, it's difficult to add anything to what already Erik Fabius has said. They're spot on. I think everybody has a big role to play. We are 8 billion people on the planet. A few of those billions are consuming much more than the rest, and so but everybody can really contribute in terms of our own daily choices, daily lifestyle. But on the other hand, consumers, although they have immense power in contributing to a greener future by adapting their lifestyles, it's also true that they need support in terms of having that choice. In many cases, consumers don't have the choice that they deserve. And so it is then a job for regulators, governments, and for businesses to provide consumers that choice, provide it in a way that is affordable, it is accessible, and it is therefore accelerating a transition in the way we live. Because that's, at the end of the day, is what we need to achieve. And so Earth Day is a moment of reflection for everybody, whether you are in a government or in a business or in an investment company or as a person, as a consumer, to think, what can we do? What is our role? Because we need a whole of society approach to win this challenge. And Earth Day is an opportunity to reflect on that and translate that reflection into action.
Indeed, and we should make every day an Earth Day. Well, thanks to all of you, Laurent Fabius, President of the Constitutional Council of French Republic, former chair of COP21, and Erik Solheim, former Under-Secretary General of the UN and President of Green Belt and Road Institute, and Marco Lambertini, Director General of WWF International. We appreciate your time. So the key messages from our guests are loud and clear. To protect our planet and preserve our own livelihoods, we need more urgent action than ever. People, governments, corporations, and more need to make changes and to deliver. And in the end of the day, the Earth is our one and only home, and as many have said, there is no planet B. And we also call on our viewers to take actions, no matter how small it is. Together, we can make a difference. And that would do it for this Earth Day special edition of Global Climate Talk on CGTN. Thanks for being with us. Until next time, bye for now.